Welcome, everyone. My name is Micah Streifer, and I'm the director of Laasok. Laasok is a virtual liberal Beit Midrash, a house of study. It's a place for liberal Jews and those who wish to study Judaism through a liberal lens to come together to connect with our texts, to connect with our Jewish tradition, and with each other through that most Jewish of acts, the act of study. At Laasok, we host a whole variety of different kinds of study, weekly Torah study groups, Midrash and Talmud study, as well as classes on various topics like this one, like our upcoming Pirkei Avot series, classes on Shabbat and prayer and God, all in an inclusive, egalitarian, liberal Jewish setting. If you're interested in exploring further study through Laasok, I would love to talk to you. I would invite you to send me a direct message through the chat, and I'll just say hi in the chat right now so that you can find me easily. There we go. There's my hi. And I'll reach out to you and we can find a time to talk. I would like, before we begin, to say a huge thank you to Angel Barnett, who is here with us for her sponsorship of this program. Thank you, Angel, for making it possible for us to study with Rabbi Washofsky today. And finally, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce our teacher for the next hour, who many of us know and some of us have even gotten to study with before. Rabbi Mark Washofsky is Emeritus Professor of Jewish Law and Practice at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati, my rabbinic alma mater. He received his rabbinical ordination and his PhD from HUC, and he taught Talmud and the Jewish legal literature there from 1985 through 2021. He served as chair of the Responsa Committee of the Central Conference of American Rabbis from 1996 through 2017. And he currently is chair of the Solomon B. Freehoff Institute of Progressive Halakha. You can check out his podcast, The 12-Minute Shiur. I actually listened to the newest episode yesterday, and it's always very interesting and not very long, which I find great for learning by podcast. Rabbi Washofsky's publications include Jewish Living, a guide to contemporary Reform practice, Reform Responsa for the 21st century, as well as numerous articles, and his newest book, which is launching next week, which is Reading Reform Responsa. And as you may have seen by email, we have received a 20% discount code if you'd like to pick up Rabbi Washofsky's newest book. I'll put that in the chat, and it also went out by email, and we're grateful to the CCAR Press for making that possible. Couple of technical notes before we get started. We are going to ask you to remain muted during the program. We've all now been using Zoom for years now. We know how it goes. But if you have questions, there will be opportunities to ask them. You can either raise your hand electronically or put it into the chat, and I'll make sure that those questions and comments make their way to Rabbi Washofsky as he's teaching. I'd like to invite you to join me in the blessing for study, and then we'll launch right in. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, eternal one, whose mitzvot make our lives holy, and who commands us to engage ourselves, to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. And now, without further ado, I'll turn things over to one of my favorite professors from rabbinical school, Rabbi Mark Washofsky.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Micah. That was lovely. So everybody, as you know, as Mike has mentioned, one of the reasons I'm here today, the main reason I'm here today, is in connection with my new book called Reading Reform Responsa. I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the whole self-promotion thing, because it can get a little much, but then I'm reminded of what Hillel says in Tractate Avot. If I do not promote myself, who will promote me, or something like that. Evidently, Hillel did not have an agent or a publisher. Still, I want to put a limit on it, so I promise that during my presentation today, I will not mention my book more than 30 times. All right, I'm gonna, that's a hard and fast limit. and I'm going to stick to it. So let's get to the topic: is there halakha in Reform Judaism? You know, if you take a look, you know, if you come across my book, that's one, and you see that there are Reform Responsa there, that is halakhic documents. We'll talk about what Responsa are in a few minutes. You know, you may wonder what I thought in Reform Judaism we didn't have this stuff, right? Halakha is identified with orthodoxy, maybe conservative Judaism, certainly not the more liberal movements like the Reform movement to which I belong. So how is it that Reform rabbis can be writing Responsa, and how can there be anything connected to Halakha and Reform Judaism? I want to respond to that question with three major points, and I'd like to try to leave time open for questions and discussion afterwards. But basically, to summarize my main point at the beginning, there is halakha in Reform Judaism. There always has been. There should be. It can't be any other way, and it's a good thing too. Okay, so that's my basic answer to the question. Now let's talk about why.
Rabbi Washofsky, you are muted.
Okay, all right. I don't must have hit that button accidentally. Okay, so let me talk about why there is halakha in Reform Judaism. And the first point I want to make is a point that was made many, many years ago by Rabbi Solomon B. Freehoff, whose name is on the Solomon B. Freehoff Institute for Progressive Halakha that Micah mentioned. Rabbi Freehoff did not invent the practice of Reform Responsa. It has existed ever since the beginnings of the Reform movement back in the early 19th century. But during his career in the 20th century, Rabbi Freehoff certainly was the major figure in Reform Responsa writing. He published 8 volumes of Reform Responsa. The very first volume of his collected Responsa, or Teshuvot, is called, appropriately enough, Reform Responsa. It appeared in 1960, so a long time ago already. But it was Rabbi Freehoff who noticed a funny thing about the rhetoric of Reform Judaism back then versus the reality of Reform Judaism. The rhetoric of Reform Judaism was all biblical in nature. That is, Reform Jews presented Reform Judaism as they understood it as grounded in the Bible, and more specifically in the prophetic books. We were all about prophetic Judaism. We were about social justice and morality. We had rejected the rabbinic heritage, the Talmud, all of the halakhic literature, the rules, the regulations about Jewish observance, Jewish law, which is sometimes the way we translate the word halakha. We have nothing to do with all of that. But it was Freehoff who noticed that all of Reform Jewish life, in all its observances, is primarily post-biblical in origin. And by post-biblical, he meant rabbinic. That is, while we talked a language of biblical prophecy, when it came to actually practicing our Judaism, we were very much rooted in the rabbinic, which is to say the halakhic tradition. I mean, think about it. The structure of our worship services, the times that we pray, the liturgy that we recite, even with all the rewriting and the creative stuff that we do, the calendar, the way we organize the Jewish year, the ways we observe Shabbat and the festivals, the ways we celebrate and mark and mourn the special moments of our life cycle. All of these are defined and structured for us, rooted in the rabbinic and specifically the halakhic literature, the literature of Jewish law. Without halakha, we wouldn't begin to know how it is that we practice our religion to the extent that our religious practice is recognizably Jewish. And when it comes to social ethics and justice, when we ask as Reform Jews, well, gee, what is the Jewish view, or what is a Jewish view, an authentically Jewish understanding of how we should act in the world around us, how to achieve social justice in the marketplace, in the political arena, when it comes to questions of medical ethics or war and peace, any question that you can phrase, such as what is the Jewish view of fill in the blank, that question, the blank, is going to be defined by the halakhic literature. That is, if you want an answer to that question, the material you're going to draw upon is in the literature of the Halakha, the Talmud, all its commentaries, the codes like Maimonides, Mishnah Torah, and the great Shulchan Aruch of Rabbi Yosef Karo and Rabbi Moshe Isserles, and the Responsa literature, the literature of questions and answers, responses that rabbis have written to questions about Jewish observance and practice, a literature that's been going on for 1,500 years in general, and almost 200 years within the Reform community. The answers to all these questions are found in the Halakha, because it's the Halakha that addresses these questions most directly. So if you want a Jewish view of how to act in the world, whether ritually or ethically as a Jew, then if you want sources, if you want text, you got to go to the halakhic literature. This is what Reform Judaism has done. And so, yes, halakha is everywhere in the Reform movement. It's all over the place. So in that sense, there is halakha in Reform Judaism. The question, I guess, for Reform Jews, or for liberal Jews in general, but certainly for Reform Jews, is how do we begin to understand what kind of Judaism it is that we profess to be observing or living? To grossly generalize, I might say there are two different ways to answer that question. We can say that our Judaism is a brand new creation. We are Reform. We don't have to listen to the voices of the past. We can draw our religion up from scratch, create it anew. So it has nothing to do with the Jewish past, the Jewish tradition. That's one approach. The other approach to describing our Reform Judaism would be that Reform Judaism is rooted in the tradition. It sees itself as an authentic expression of that tradition. And while it certainly differs from other expressions of Jewish tradition, that's where it begins, and it is that tradition of which it is a continuation. I'm going to go on a limb and say that most Reform Jews define their Reform Judaism in that second way, namely that Reform Judaism, to be authentically and understandably Jewish, has to be an outgrowth and expression of Jewish tradition. Well, if that is the case, then the tradition we're talking about, when we talk about matters of practice and observance, the way we pray, the way we celebrate Shabbat and the holidays, so forth and so on, the way we act in the world as Jews, that tradition is going to be the halakha, has to be. That's where the sources are, that's where the texts are, that's where we draw the material that we use liberally and creatively to construct our Judaism. So yes, there is halakha in Reform Judaism. The second point I want to make is simply that if you're still in doubt as to whether there's halakha in Reform Judaism, one way to respond to that question, to that doubt, is simply to look at the rather large amount of halakhic literature that the Reform movement has produced. this literature, the publications of the CCAR and the Union for Reform Judaism and other Reform rabbinic organizations and individual Reform Jewish scholars over the years, having to do with matters of practice and observance. If you take a look at those books, Guides to Jewish Life, Guides to Jewish Practice and Observance, and take a look in the back of the book, where you'll find the end notes, where are the sources from which we're drawing our material, you'll see that these books, these self-proclaimed and self-consciously reformed guides to Judaism, are rooted in the Halakha. They have to be. Where else are you going to bring your material when it comes to describing what Shabbat means, when it comes to understanding how it is that we construct a Passover Seder, or how it is that we build a sukkah, or how it is that we observe the ceremonies of the life cycle. Reform halakhic literature is rooted in the traditional halakha. Again, halakha is everywhere in Reform Judaism. Now that fact raises an important question that we're going to have to address at some point. So let's talk about it now. We Reform Jews, in our current rhetoric, that is the way we talk about our religion, stress the word autonomy, right? The principle of autonomy is the idea that I, as an individual, get to make my own laws, my own nomos, that is the rules by which I live. I am the source of authority. No external source of authority can tell me what to do. And so therefore, if I get to make my own rules, how can we have any communication with halakha, which is it's an experience of law. And halakha and law are not exactly the same thing, but they're close enough that we can draw that analogy, because like law, halakha is about rules, principles, and thinking about those rules and principles in a way that yield guidance, that yield governance, that, the halakha tells us what to do, what not to do, that kind of thing. How can we have this kind of influence? How can we be citing rules and sources from the halakhic literature, when we believe in autonomy, the right of individuals to make their own religious decisions? It's a complicated question. You don't have time to go into all of its ramifications here, but let me just point out that autonomy does not mean indifference, right? The fact that each individual Reform Jew has the right, the power to make their own religious decisions does not mean that other Reform Jews, rabbis, for instance, are indifferent as to the decisions that those individuals might make. All of us probably believe that whatever decision somebody else might make, yeah, okay, you're in charge of making that decision, but some decisions are better than others. Some decisions are worse than others, and some decisions are just plain bad. All right? We all know this. Rabbis and teachers of Judaism have these opinions too. And when called upon for guidance, right, because people would like to know, what do you guys think about X, Y, and Z? They're going to tell you. Although you have the authority as an individual, the autonomy as an individual to be your own authority to make your own decisions, we're not indifferent to the decision you make. Here's what I think you ought to do. You asked, okay, and here's why, right? So that's part of the package. Autonomy does not mean indifference. Autonomy also does not mean ignorance, right? The fact that any one of us is allowed to make our own decisions about matters of religion does not mean that we think it's a good idea that we should make these decisions from the basis of no knowledge at all. On the contrary, the Reform movement talks a great deal about a concept called informed choice or informed decision-making or choice through knowledge. It's phrased in different ways. But the idea is that as individual Reform Jews, we should study the matter. Well, the matter has to do with some question of Jewish practice, how to live as a Jew. We should study it. and then make our own decision on the basis of information. Well, if we believe that, and we say we do, then the source that we have to study is primarily the halakhic literature, because again, it's the halakhic literature where we're going to find the rabbinic discussions and commentaries and debates and arguments about how to answer, how to address questions of practice and observance. So that's why we read the traditional halakhic literature, and that's why we produce halakhic literature of our own, because we don't think ignorance is a good thing. We think informed choice is a good thing. That's the best way to be an autonomous Jew in a liberal or Reform Jewish sense. And this brings me to my third point, which is about Reform Responsa, the subject of my book. Okay, that's two. Reform rabbis have been writing Responsa, as I said, from the very beginnings of the Reform movement. The CCAR, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, has had a Responsa committee ever since 1906, and largely through the efforts of Rabbi Freehoff later in the century, and then the Responsa committee. Since then, there are over 1,300 Reform Responsa in existence, that is collated official products of the CCAR that are available on the website and are out there. So Reform Responsa as a genre, as a body of literature is a considerable thing. There's a lot of that stuff out there. What are these responsa? Anyway, responsa is a plural word, by the way. Responsum is the singular. It's Latin. Why do we call this by a Latin word? Probably because in the 19th century, people thought that would make it respectable. Not sure. But that's the minhag today, right? So that's what we do. What are these responsa about? If you say that we have autonomy as individuals, right? I mean, in a traditional Jewish context, certainly in Orthodoxy, if you ask a question of a rabbi, certainly if it's your rabbi, that is your own personal halakhic authority, and you say, Rabbi, I have a shaila, I have a she'elah, I have a question about some aspect of practice, give me an answer. The rabbi gives you an answer. You're supposed to listen to him. You're supposed to listen to that answer because, well, the assumption is that is the authority of Torah, the authority of halakha as it speaks to this question. It is spoken through the mouth of this particular rabbi, but the rabbi is interpreting the sources and the texts in which the material that you got to turn to find these answers. And when the rabbi comes up with an answer, that's authoritative. That's as though the answer came down from Sinai. This is what you're supposed to do. Obviously, it doesn't work that way in Reform Judaism. So how does it work? What are these responsa? Well, obviously, if responsa are not authoritative in the sense that they tell us what we have to do, they may be authoritative in another way. That is, authorities can be those to whom we turn for advice, those to whom we turn for guidance, even though we do not say in advance, I promise to do whatever you say. Responsa are advisory in nature in the Reform movement. A Reform responsum says to the reader, that is the individual who asked the question, and to anyone else who might be reading this later, someone asked us a question, and here is our response. Here is our understanding of the best answer to that question. Reform responsa, like responsa in general, are about argumentation. Right? If you look at traditional responsa, they are overwhelmingly, well, the technical word is discursive in nature, and that is very few Orthodox responsa reply to a question with one word, right? Yes, no, kosher, treif, permitted, forbidden. Some do. Back in the days of Maimonides, the Rambam, he sometimes wrote responsa that were that short, but for the vast majority of responsa, what you get is not only the answer to the question that is asked, but the rabbi who writes that particular teshuvah or responsum will also give you the reasons why he, and nowadays she or they, understand this answer to be the best one, that is the best interpretation of the sources of Judaism on this question. Now, argumentation is vital. It's crucial in understanding the role of responsa in any context, but especially the Reform context. For one thing, responsa tend to be written in response to difficult or interesting questions, right? I mean, you have a question, you need an answer. If the question is a simple one, if it has an obviously correct answer, chances are it's not going to get to some authority in Barcelona in the 13th century or in Lublin in the 16th century or the Responsa Committee of the CCAR in the 21st century. You know, if it's just a question of information, you look it up in a book or you ask somebody who knows, fine, they give you the answer. That's all you need. Questions that get turned into responsa tend to be questions that maybe don't have a simple, obviously correct answer in the Jewish tradition. It could go one way, it could go another way, right? Because new questions come up all the time. Questions that the sources have not yet worked out one single consensus response to that question. And so we have to figure out answers. And the only way to do that is through argumentation. We have to look at the text, try to figure out what they're saying. We have to draw analogies from things we already know to this new situation that's been brought to our attention and hope that our answers will apply to that new situation. And then we'll try to figure out what the best response is to it. Argumentation then is about trying to identify the best out of a plurality of plausible answers to the question. And it's also about trying to persuade a community, not just the individual who asks the question, but whoever should read this answer in the future, try to persuade a community of readers to understand their Judaism, at least on this particular question, in this particular way, right? A responsum cannot say, well, here's the answer because we've always had this answer. We haven't always had this answer. We're just working it out as we go along. So I've got to tell you why I think it's the best answer, why I think other possible answers to the question are not as good as this one. And I hope that you will be persuaded to go along with me, right? Because if I'm sitting in 13th century Barcelona and I'm writing this question to somebody living hundreds or thousands of miles away, I'm writing this responsum to that person, I have no way of knowing whether that person will actually do the things I say. I can try to persuade them and anyone else who reads my answer that this is the best answer. This is the best answer to the question. So responsa are about persuasion. In the Reform context, then, a responsum, you can think of Reform responsa as models of how we should try to arrive at our autonomous decisions about what to do as Jews. Here's a question. Here's how we might best think about it. Here are the sources that traditionally speak to questions like this. Let's read these sources. Let's think about them from our self-consciously Reform or liberal Jewish perspective. And then let's come up with an answer. If you don't like the answer that the author or authors of that particular responsum have come up with, well, great. Argue back. Tell us why, right? A responsum is an invitation in this sense. It's an invitation to further discussion, further argument. It is an invitation, obviously, to agreement, right? Someone who writes a persuasive text hopes and invites you to agree with their conclusion. But if you don't, the author or authors of that persuasive text, that example of persuasive writing, would like you to engage in the debate so that ultimately the answer that draws us all together in the end will be the best one that we can reach. That's how Reform responsa have operated throughout the history of the Reform responsa process. And that that is the role that Reform Responsa play in a movement that sometimes considered itself non-halakhic, but in fact is plenty halakhic if you simply look at what it is we do, what it is we believe, and how it is we have operated over the years. Responsa are therefore crucial and essential as a part of our Reform Jewish expression, and they always have been. And I like to think of my book, that's 3, as, again, an invitation to take a look at how this process works, how to read these responsa with a critical eye, that is to see how they operate, how they construct arguments, how they try to build community, draw us together around a particular answer to the particular question that's been asked. And therefore, how through that process they contribute to the creation of Reform Jewish life and Reform Jewish thought. So that's all I have at this point, and we have some time left. If anybody has questions,
Yep. So there are a
we can
couple of
discuss.
questions
Mhm.
in the chat here. And so I'll just start at the beginning. Rabbi Paula Goldberg asks, is there any part of traditional halakha that could be considered universal or binding on Reform Jews? And then I guess I'll ask 2 questions at once, because Daniel Schreiber asked the opposite in a sense, which is some part of halakha, is there some part of halakha that is, he put congregationally, but I think we could say in general, refused or left out entirely? So I guess which parts of halakha might we consider binding? Which parts of halakha might we just reject entirely?
Yeah, very good questions. And they're the sort of question that you can answer as an individual or as a community, right? As an individual, you have to come up with your own answer to that. As a community, I think the best advice I could give is this philosopher, happens to be a Jewish guy, Hilary Putnam, who has said that in thinking about philosophical questions, it's a good idea to start from where we are. Which, yeah, where else am I going to start from? But no, what he means by that is recognize that we are situated in a particular place. I, as an individual, we as a community, we have a history. We're not looking from a God's eye perspective on the question. We've gotten to a particular place in time and in our culture and the way we think. So let's take a look at what it is we're doing. Rabbi Freehoff, already in 1960, in the introduction to the first volume of Reform Responsa, lists a whole number of areas of traditional halakha which are not practiced anymore, even by Orthodox Jews, certainly not by the Orthodox Jews in his day. Obviously, anything having to do with the sacrificial cult in Jerusalem, many of the purity regulations that we find discussed in the Mishnah and the Talmud, and he goes on and on. He says most Jews today do not take their problems, their issues to a rabbinic court for adjudication. They go to the court of the country in which they find themselves. This is something that the Rabbanut in Israel tries to fight against. They bring your questions to the Beit Din instead of the Beit Mishpat, the secular court. But Freehoff's point is there's a lot of the halakha that even Orthodox Jews don't observe. So I think that was part of his argument that Reform Jews are not alone in this area. In Reform Judaism, it used to be said that, there's very little of the traditional halakha that we consider binding. First of all, you have to think, well, what does it mean binding? The issue of autonomy comes in. But if you're looking at what Reform Jews do, there was a time when we could say, in terms of traditional halakhic observance, the answer is not much. That has changed over the decades. And so now you find Reform Jews putting on talit and tefillin in the mornings, Reform Jews observing kashrut, Reform Jews being more observant of various aspects of liturgical and holiday practice. So it's very difficult to say that there's any one thing that is binding on everybody, or for that matter, there's any one thing that nobody does. You'll have to just take a look at your particular community and see what it is the community pays attention to, takes seriously. It's a matter that's very much in flux.
I think Paula just put a rider question on that. Paula, do you want to unmute and ask your question about ethical versus ritual?
Well, I think that when we are talking about halakha, most people are thinking only of ritual observance. And so I was wondering, in terms of ethical issues, I know that ritual and ethical are not necessarily always dividable, but in terms of some ethical issues, is there any universal acceptance of halakha that pretty much everybody observes, whether it's a positive ethical issue or negative ethical issue, something like that?
Well, I mean, there is, if we say we can divide all of the mitzvot into ritual and then ethical, Reform Judaism has always said, okay, ethics is absolutely, positively binding on all of us. We have to be ethical. Then you have to ask the question, why are we saying that? Are we saying that because we're thinking of ethics as something universal, or are we thinking of it as something particularly Jewish? In other words, to do the right thing, well, you don't have to be Jewish to want to do the right thing. And in any particular situation, what is the right thing to do? The way we normally come to that conclusion in our lives is to think ethically, that I start with my basic understanding of right and wrong and doing good to others. These are not particularly Jewish or specifically Jewish concerns, right? So I may go through my life making ethical decisions whenever I'm called upon to do so, without thinking at all about specifically Jewish sources. But when I do, and okay, this is number 4 in the book, there are several questions of the ethical variety. And the reason I put them in there, and I think I talk about this at some point, is that precisely this, we generally, we're modern liberal people. We make our ethical decisions in the same way other people like us who are not Jewish make those decisions. So what's specifically Jewish about ethics? Well, the answer is nothing, except that there is a specifically Jewish tradition of thinking about all these questions. And if someone wants to think Jewishly about an ethical issue, all right, so that's a question, that's a decision they have to make. I don't have to think Jewishly about this, but if I do, if I want to know what Judaism thinks about, let's say one of the issues is the force feeding of political prisoners, which it's in the last chapter of the book, and it was that was a big issue about 20 years ago when we were fighting the war on terror and all of that we had all these prisoners who went on hunger strikes, force feeding them, which was something that was done in the military prisons. Does Judaism have a position on this? Now, I might have an opinion about force feeding, positive or negative, without even considering what Judaism has to say. I may not need Judaism, therefore, to give me an answer that is satisfying. But the minute I ask, what does Judaism have to say? Glad you asked. There is something that there's a way that Judaism can address this question. It's halakha, and here, let's go through the process. Now, at the very end of that process, halakha will also come up with an answer, allow you to come up with an answer. It might be yes, it might be no, just like ethics, general ethics does. The difference is that you've thought about this in a Jewish way, so that your decision, you might think, is richer. It's more rooted in a tradition that you find meaningful. So yeah, ethics is binding on us. I think we all believe that. Is Jewish ethics binding on us? I think to the extent that we want to be authentically Jewish, then maybe, well, it should be. And that's maybe that's all I could say.
We have a couple more questions here. This comes from Tessa in the chat. What about the idea of patrilineal descent versus matrilineal descent in the US and Canada? And I happen to know that Tessa is Canadian, so clearly this is a different issue on both sides of the border. She asks, how does halakha impact that? And if I can just add to that question, there's another note in the chat from Rabbi Sandra Cohen. Looks like this came just to me, but I think it's an additional question. On top of this, she adds egalitarianism, acceptance of LGBTQ. So these are areas that it seems to me are significant breaks from traditional halakha.
Right.
What's the role of halakhic thinking in those decisions?
Yeah. So there are, let's get back to what I said before about starting from where you are. One of the fundamental, if there are axioms of Reform Jewish thinking, halachic and otherwise, it is that we make certain, we have certain starting points. There, egalitarianism, gender equality is one of them, right? So that any answer, any decision that is going to make a distinction between the genders on a question of ritual or question of observance in life, that kind of thing, is a non-starter for us. It simply is. So the Reform movement from the very beginning championed gender equality. How well it put that into practice is a historical question, but we keep, I guess we keep working on it. Similarly, our openness to questions of gender identity and acceptance of people in the LGBTQ community and the different expressions of identity that come out of all of that. Reform Judaism is committed from the very beginning to try to accept these individual expressions to the greatest extent that any community can. So, yeah, in areas like that, the traditional halakha we have consciously set aside because we're not going there. Now, one of the things we do in the Reform Responsa writing process is that we try as much as we can when questions like this come up, we try to give our own modern liberal consciousness a halachic perspective, which is to say, we think the traditional halakha, when read through a prism of liberality, the filter that we bring to the sources, and we think that everybody brings their own filters to the reading of their own sources. That's just the way we read things. Interpreted our way, the sources actually support the decisions that we've made in these areas. So, we go back retroactively and we try to connect what we're doing now with the sources in our tradition as much as we can, because we, at the same time that we say these new ways of understanding, let's say, gender identity are quite new, but that doesn't mean we think of them as divorced from everything that has happened in the Jewish past. With respect to patrilineality, I mean, that, this is also, it's an interesting, it's an interesting example of how we've tried to do that. The idea that a person born of a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother could claim Jewish identity and become recognized fully as Jewish if that individual experience was brought up as a Jew, and and their Jewish identity was affirmed through one of those public and timely ceremonies and expressions that our so-called patrilineality resolution talks about. That idea is quite new, right? Because in traditional halakha, one phrase in the Mishnah says it all. If the mother is not Jewish, her child takes on her identity, period. And it doesn't matter. So yes, we have we have departed from that standard. But taking a look at the way in which that resolution is argued, taking a look at the way that responsa that have been written about it, the resolution was passed in 1983, and there are a number of responsa that have been written in an attempt to interpret the terms of that resolution and apply them to specific cases. The responsa committee sought to understand the resolution as much as it can and the question of Jewish identity as much as it can in traditional Jewish terms. That is, we maintain the traditional structure of Jewish identity. There are two ways in which one can become a Jew. You can be born a Jew, or you can become Jewish by choice through the process of Giyur or conversion. What we've done in the case of born Jewishness, that Judaism by birth, we've broadened the way in which that can be understood. But Reform Responsa have emphasized that traditional halakhic structure of Jewish identity and tried to make sure that, let's say, people, who make claims of Jewish identity that come from outside that framework, no, you have to go through that framework in order to officially enter the community. So we bring the halakha to bear as much as we can on the decisions we make. But if we need to make those decisions for good moral and ethical or social justice reasons, we make them.
This is just me now, isn't it also a recognition that the Jewish tradition has always been evolving? You mentioned, acceptance of LGBTQ issues is new. Patrilineal descent is new. The ways we think about gender identity and conversion in some sense are new today. But aren't we, by using a halakhic argumentation, aren't we recognizing that at one time matrilineal descent was new? That, that the halakhic tradition has evolved and therefore we're continuing to evolve it?
I mean, that's part of it, certainly. If you stand at a historical distance, I mean, if you're looking at Jewish tradition like an anthropologist or a historian of religion, you can see that tradition evolving and changing. So you say, okay, well, then I can draw a conclusion about the nature of Judaism. I would draw this about other religions too, is that these are evolving things. A religious tradition is not a static thing. It always changes in response to confrontation with new circumstances and all of that. The question is that what's the difference between the external stance that you would take as a historian or an academic scholar and somebody working from within the tradition? I know I've in my career, I mean, I was, I had a split personality with respect to these things because I had to always ask myself, am I looking at this as an academic, or am I trying to look at this as a rabbi writing a responsa? Because it's one thing to say everything evolves, everything changes, but there's another thing to say, okay, what answer should I give right now to a question that's being asked? The fact that, gee, things have always evolved is not a good argument, legally speaking. I mean, a lawyer cannot make that argument in front of a judge. And an ethicist cannot make that argument in front of whatever community the ethicist is speaking of. Well, because other cultures eat their children, therefore it must be okay. No. I mean, evolution happens, but the way we as a community make decisions is an internal process. So while we recognize change, and that's one of the ways we explain what we're doing, and we have tried to insert as much pluralism into our responses as we can. Reform Judaism makes a point of saying we can tolerate more than one answer to most questions, not all of them. Some questions of which we draw a line, say this is it. But for the most part, we are comfortable with more than one answer, but there are limits, because at a certain point we say no. And when you say, well, what do you mean no? my favorite example here of the question of, I don't know, Jews for Jesus, right? One of these people comes to you and says, why can't I join your community as a full member? And we respond, well, but see, but your religion we understand is Christianity. And they say, well, 2,000 years ago, it was Judaism. It was just a different form of Judaism. Why can't you recognize evolution and admit me? And the answer is because that's not where we are. We have to think about this from where we are. If it was 2,000 years ago, I'd have a different answer. I'd also be wearing different clothes and probably sandals on my feet without socks. And okay, all right, fine. But I mean, we're not there. We're not there. And so there's a limit to what the argument from evolution can accomplish. But yes, it is a fact that change has happened, and we recognize that. And frankly, Orthodox Jews who are honest about the history of Judaism recognize it as well.
I think we have time for one more question, and actually that that leads into the question that Rabbi Rochelle put into the chat, and then I'll call on David, and maybe Rabbi Washofsky can handle two questions at once. Rabbi Rochelle says, how much do societal standards or views influence responsa? And she uses the example of body modification, tattoos, plastic surgery, and piercings. The argument, I'm just going to read what she wrote. The argument is often about our bodies being on loan, or we are B'Tselem Elohim, but at the same time, earrings are generally accepted as okay. Nose rings, or worse, are more questionable, I guess, because those are societal norms. So that's the one question. And then I saw David Bernstein's hand come up. David, do you have something to add or to ask as well?
Thanks, Rabbi Schleifer, and it's related in some sense to that question. As a non-rabbi, but one who's a person who's firmly entrenched in the Reform movement, I think often about, and as someone who's a lawyer, I think about sources and where I find meaning, and I hope to look to something like what you discussed during this hour for meaning and answers to questions. But part of how I think about whether something has merit is how you come up with your answers, and what's the basis of the responsa. And I guess my question to you was, is there responsa on responsa?
Responsa on responsa, you mean?
Sorry, maybe that's worded poorly. Is there a guiding document that exists or develops over time as to how you or people who make these decisions come up with these responses?
Well, let me start with that. The answer is no, and it's a good thing, because that document, the minute it would be adopted by a responsa committee or by the conference as a whole, would be outdated. Simply as we change. We change because, for one thing, we keep reading the same sources. We keep learning new things from them. Different interpretations that suggest themselves to us. And we find that we cannot be bound by our own self-imposed intellectual handcuffs, if you will, or commitments, if you want to put it nicely, from last year or a generation ago. We're different people. One of the reasons we're different people is that we are influenced by societal norms, which gets back to the first question about tattooing and that kind of, and piercing and so forth. There is a reform responsum on that question. All these responsa exist on the website, the CCAR responsa website. So if you go to ccarnet.org, that is then it's a rabbi speak. You click on that, and one of the things that comes up is Reform Responsa. Click on Reform Responsa, there'll be a search box. And if you play around with the search box, put tattooing in that box, you'll come up with an answer. You'll come at least, with some sources. Check out that responsum, which was written, I don't know, about 20 years ago, and see just how the committee twisted and turned with precisely on this question. We're in God's image. Our body is supposed to be, we're supposed to take treat our body as holy, or at least you know, we're not supposed to damage it unnecessarily, but we've always pierced our ears. Is this nothing but social standards? But, you know, at the time, the people who wrote this Responsa looked at people with tattoos and piercing, and they went, ooh, you know, so what is that, you know, what is the status of that ooh thing, okay? Which kind of gets back to your question, David, about how we decide questions. Normally, I would say that just because I look at a phenomenon and I have a gut reaction, oh, that's bad, or that's good. I would think, well, that reaction, that's not an intelligent thing, a gut reaction. Well, actually, a gut reaction should not be ignored. I think, you know, if we automatically, instinctively almost, respond to a particular phenomenon in a certain way, let's take that seriously. We can't be satisfied with that, because then we have to ask, why do we respond that way? Is there nothing other than our gut to that response? Does our tradition suggest that there's another possible response to this? If our reaction is anchored only in the norms of society, that's not necessarily unimportant or irrelevant. Look, I live in society. The norms of society are important to me. If I don't observe social norms, I'm not going to get very far. But is that the best Jewish answer I can come up with? Well, you know, so we wrestle and we struggle with this. There's almost no way I can think of to define the path of that struggle, set rules to how we look at the text in advance. If you're looking for a control mechanism over Reform Responsa, that is, what answers are going to be given, what answers are going to be accepted, I think you just have to look at things that are written and whether they are accepted or not. As we move, as we grow as a community, we figure out our answers as best we can, step by step. Sometimes we go a little far, sometimes we don't go far enough, but it is through the workings of consensus, and here I am speaking as an academic again, from the outside looking in, a community comes up gradually over time with a common understanding of its position on certain questions. It may take a long time before the community comes to one answer. Maybe they never will, but they will develop answers to their questions as they go. And I think that's probably the most and the best that we can say, you know, as a matter of process.
Well, I just want to say thank you to Dr. Washofsky for a really fascinating discussion and lecture over the last hour. I know I learned a lot, and I'm grateful that we were able to be here. Thank you to Angel Barnett for sponsoring this program. Thank you to everybody for being here today, and to the CCAR for promoting and bringing us together as well. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.